All right, welcome back to the Nexus podcast. I am very happy to have Matthew Rogers with me today. Matthew is the ICS cybersecurity strategy and R&D lead at CISA, and he's also the lead for CISA's Secure by Design for OT initiative. His big focus right now is, of course, the application of research and development initiatives across the industry and how those efforts can improve cybersecurity within critical infrastructure sectors. So really in our sweet zone here today. Recently, CISA and a number of international partners published a guide aimed at OT asset owners and operators. The guide's called Secure by Demand, Priority Considerations for Operational Technology Owners and Operators when Selecting Digital Products. It features 12 security items that OT owners and operators should be looking for during procurement cycles with automation and control system vendors. So really interesting stuff, and I want to cover all of that with Matthew today, and maybe dig a little bit more into CISA's Secure by Design initiative overall. So that said, let's bring in Matthew and kick off the episode. How you doing, Matt? Good to meet you.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, you bet. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your day to day, because I know we hadn't met before connecting for the podcast. So.
Sure. So I'm Matthew Rogers. I've been doing infrastructure at CISA for about a year and a half now, almost. So by background, OT, I feel like everybody has like a weird niche for how they got into sort of operational technology, cybersecurity, much less cybersecurity at all. My background is really in the vehicle and transportation system space. So I used to build detection systems for serial data bus networks on planes, trains, and tanks. So a lot of fun niche cybersecurity challenges. So I have a PhD in doing stuff like that. And, for the last couple of years, I've been trying to focus more on broader critical infrastructure. So role at CISA is really, looking at a lot of the services, and a lot of them that are free that CISA provides to private critical infrastructure entities, and saying, how can we take the best efforts, the best research and development for critical infrastructure, and make sure that's being applied across sectors. So Secure by Design is really a part of this, right? Like if I am trying to make it so that the power grid is really secure, but also a small water entity is really secure, well, like they have very different resources. They have very different abilities to actually negotiate to get cybersecurity into their systems. And so one of the things that kept coming up over and over again is, yeah, I would love to do cybersecurity, but either I don't know what to ask for because I don't have the right personnel, or my procurement officers don't know what to ask, or, I'm just a small player here. I can't really afford to negotiate and try to get newer security functionalities in play. So, maybe like a big energy, like bulk energy generation or oil, natural gas company could afford like some really hard top edge cybersecurity requirements. And the real question is how can we take some of those cybersecurity functionalities that we really want to secure our critical infrastructure and make those more accessible, not just to the richest sectors, to the sectors who can afford to play hardball to negotiate a little bit more. So what really spun out this guidance is, let's make sure that authentication is a little bit more normalized, that some of the security functionality, even just like basic like user access logs and logging built into products at like the OT level, at the controller level, is something that is not something you really have to negotiate for. The idea being if we get more people asking for it, it's this whole idea of secure by demand, is if we can help generate that demand signal and make it a little more clear, a little more similar across different sectors, then vendors will have enough of an incentive, enough of a buy-in to go to their own business leaders, to go to their own product development teams. And then the security people can afford to basically make that a unified product, right? Like you can make security features all day, but until that's like a core code library that you just copy and paste between all of your products, that's something that you've really got to pay for if you're the end customer. But if enough people asking for this stuff, then it becomes more ubiquitous. These sort of security decisions are just something that comes with the product rather than something you have to know to ask for.
Right.
You never really want to get into a world where you got to ask,
Yeah. It does seem like the security baseline, so to speak, for OT products is kind of all over the place. And I mean, was that kind of the goal in terms of at least at a minimum trying to put a baseline on paper, so to speak?
There have been a lot of efforts to set different baselines across a lot of security fields. So I'm a little fraught to say that that was my goal. But it's, in essence, yes, it was how can we help both the security personnel at the company? Because one story I have for kind of what spun off this document is I was at my favorite security conference. If you get a chance to attend, I highly recommend it. It's the North American Transit Cybersecurity Consortium. Basically, like all of the major mass transit entities and their CISOs and their security teams, as well as like relevant security vendors and
Yeah.
integrators, all go to this conference. It's a great time. It's one of the few conferences. Cybersecurity can be a little nihilistic sometimes, but it's a good group because they're all really working towards, okay, like we all have these shared challenges. How can we work to help each other out? And something that came up pretty frequently at these events over the last couple of years has been, okay, like I as an asset owner want this. And the vendor goes, yes, I understand you want this. I have to financially justify spending the time to incorporate this security functionality instead of this, like engineering functionality that would make the product better for whatever sector it's being integrated into. And it's really hard to justify that if you don't think the risks are there, if you don't have the external motivation, right? And so we are trying to provide some of that external motivation that security teams can point to maybe establish a baseline, but really just saying, these are cybersecurity functionalities we know will help you be more resilient against the threats we're
Hmm.
seeing. Mostly citing stuff like Vault Typhoon, citing stuff like Cyber Avengers, these groups that are just hacktivists attacking internet exposed devices. How can we make it so that in 5 years, 10 years, people aren't looking back at the technology they're buying and going, oh, well, that's legacy infrastructure. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest fears we've heard from a number of sectors is, the government's telling me I need to be more secure. Okay, cool. I bought a bunch of stuff and they told me my infrastructure was all legacy and bad and didn't have security functionality back in 2025. And in 2030, are they going to tell me the same thing about the stuff I bought 5 years ago?
Right.
And so how can we give people the information about what they should be asking for? So, security is always going to change, but can we give them something that's at least a little more upgradable, right? Like you're never going to go wrong with logging. You're never going to go wrong with some sort of identity and access management policy. These are things that you can build on, where if you just have a fully trusting network, I mean, that's when we really get into these legacy conversations.
Right. And what's your sense for the amount of buying power that enterprises might have today with OT vendors and as it relates to cybersecurity? I mean, is it just the big players that might have this kind of influence or potential influence? What's the overall procurement process like?
In my experience, that is the case. If you would like to actually get some sort of newer security functionality, then it's kind of limited to some of the larger utilities, the larger asset owners. A large part of that is because, in theory, they could ask for it and they could pay for it, but every sector has their own, particularly at like a public utility level, has a lot of limitations on how much they can actually make something cost. So even if that cybersecurity might be cheaper in the long run, the upfront utility cost it might just be not okay due to like local or federal level regulations. And
Hmm.
so it's really just that makes it so that that functionality never becomes super ubiquitous. I mean, I've seen extreme examples of some of the larger ONG players. Like one of the functionalities they wanted was containerization on their controllers, which is like a cool idea. It's kind of a norm in other software fields to put everything in a container. It's a little bit more resilient because if it falls over, it's going to get back up rather quickly. So it kind of makes sense in a lot of OT settings. Um, a lot of vendors were not really willing to do it, and so they just refused to buy from everybody for about a year until they got this capability. Most folks can't afford to wait and just not buy
Right.
anything for another year. And so, what we're really trying to hope with this document is that, yes, any individual group doesn't have a lot of buying power, but if enough folks are asking for the same things, then now other sectors are going to be able to benefit from the sectors that do have a lot of buying power. Or maybe we're going to increase the buying power of some of the larges and mediums so that they can at least get some of these security functionalities. We cite some of the standards for this exact reason, right? Like we cite ISA IEC 62443 security level 3, specifically for 4-2 and 3-3. And one of the reasons we cite these industry standards is, it's really helpful if everybody's speaking the same language. And so, right now there aren't that many security level 3 products in the market. Like we're very aware of that as a challenge. And I don't expect this to be fixed immediately. I don't expect this to necessarily suddenly a bunch of SL3 products appear on the market next
Right.
year. But if people start asking for pieces of it, suddenly SL3 might go from this hyper premium functionality where there's only a handful of products that are certified to it. And now we might see some of the functionality in SL3, even if the product isn't certified at the end of the day, some of the functionality like crypto agility or certificate management might just be a little bit more ubiquitous because it could be built into these devices.
So it almost sounds like that the intent, or maybe that just an outcome, is not necessarily exclusively market pressure kind of forcing the vendors to do this, but giving the vendors some ammunition to go to their business leaders and say, hey, there's a demand for XYZ related to security. Let's start building it in. Is that a fair assessment?
For sure. We've one of the other initiatives that CISA has been running for the past year is something called the Secure by Design Pledge. And so we have over 250 companies that have signed on to a pledge to not solve cybersecurity in a year, but to demonstrate progress that they can actually transparently show, release presentations on, to show that they are really working towards securing their customers and really taking ownership of some of their customer security outcomes. And one of the things in that pledge is eliminating default passwords. And I think if you talk to most security folks, they're going to tell you, well, yeah, we want to eliminate default passwords. That's just a good idea. There's some OT caveats we can throw in there with like remote devices. But we literally ran to one company that signed the pledge where they had PowerPoints like 5 years old on how to eliminate default passwords from their organization. It's just that when you're trying to make that business case argument, sales, whatever maintenance, whatever, customer helpline people are all going to come back and say, well, yes, we could eliminate default passwords. It's a good security decision, but that's going to cost us money because now our customers are going to come back, our integrators are going to come back, and they're going to have a little bit more friction to actually doing some of the initial setup and deployment. And so that's a business calculation you have to take. But we're trying to give the security people more ammunition to do what we think is the right thing to do, which is eliminating some of these default passwords from the offset. Because we've seen when it's up to the end asset owner or it's up to the end utility, it's not that these people can't change a default password. They absolutely can. It's just if you're deploying hundreds or thousands of products, your chance that you mess up and don't correctly deploy any one product is relatively high. And so how can we just take that risk and just eliminate it? And one example of that is eliminating default passwords. So we are trying to give ammunition to the security teams to help them make these choices at their company level.
Yeah, I mean, like the secure by default stuff, like default passwords. I mean, it just makes so much sense that I think it would surprise a lot of people just to think that that's not already available out of the box. Something as simple as not allowing a default password or making sure it's changed. And I guess we're still not in that position, even though we've been advocating for a long time.
Yeah, and this is the thing. I think to your point about like advocating for a long time, I don't know that there's very much novel about a lot of the secure by design work. What we're really trying to do is elevate a lot of the hard work of cybersecurity researchers who've been doing all of this and advocating for this for years, if not decades. There's one paper from like the 1970s we cite in some of our presentations about how it's very difficult to add cybersecurity after the fact if you do not design it in from the beginning. And so it's like, well, yeah, like people have been saying this for years. How do we, taking our role as a government agency and the national coordinator for critical infrastructure and eliminating cyber risk, how can we take that role and actually make it easier for folks to do what they've wanted to do this whole time, which is secure their critical infrastructure?
So as I mentioned in the introduction, there's 12 security elements in the guide, and all of them, are what you'd expect, as you kind of hinted at. But how did you land on these 12? Like, who was involved in the process? I'm sure there was a bit of feedback internally before coming out with the document.
We actually did a workshop at the conference S4 back in 2020, February of 2024, which maybe tells you how long it takes to get things out sometimes.
Yeah.
But international coordination, I think, is really worth it at the end of the day to do some of these delays. But basically, we started with 7. I'm trying to remember if I can get the exact ones. It's I think configuration management, logging the baseline product, secure by default, secure communications, secure controls, strong authentication, and upgrade and patch tooling. We started with those based off of really just a threat picture, saying like, okay, we know that there are actors like Vault Typhoon who are exploiting edge devices more and more. If edge devices, which are primarily the tool that is being used to implement segmentation, if those edge devices are being compromised, well, that means that we need more defense in depth in operational technology networks, because we can't just have this sort of bubble that we've painted around OT saying like it's segmented off, or God forbid we say it's air gapped. Then because it's not. We've seen this time and time again, right? Like, segmentation is one of those security controls that is undoubtedly a good idea for operational technology, but we've also seen that it's really difficult to get right, and it's really difficult to implement 100% correct. There's always going to be a flaw for actors who are motivated enough to try and find it. And so a lot of our drivers were really saying, if we know that this barrier is going to be further eroded by actors compromising edge devices, how can we make sure that you can put resilience into the OT network itself? Because there's the kind of standard combination we've been seeing is some mix of segmentation and continuous monitoring around the boundary. And while that's great, and that does a lot of really good work, it is not as helpful for some of the smaller players. So one of my favorite examples is multi-factor authentication. And if you think about like multi-factor authentication, I don't know, like taking out your phone as you control a PLC and getting like a 2-factor code, like it sounds very silly. Of course, that's probably the worst implementation imaginable in an OT setting. But
Right.
if you're a small water operator and you don't trust that your segmentation is good or correct, or that you can afford the security team necessary to maintain high quality segmentation, well, you probably don't input MFA on every single one of your controllers. But if you know that you've got some crown jewels, if these devices are compromised, if these devices are manipulated, that's a bad day for me. Well, then you might put MFA on that, even if it is a little bit more laborious for you, because that's an additional safety check. So it is just, the goal is really to allow utilities to make their own risk-informed decisions. But if MFA is a premium functionality that you pay, I don't know, like $2,000 for, to have that when you initially buy the device,
Right.
that's a hard decision. Now you've got to plan out your security
Mm-hmm.
perfectly from the offset. Which, if you're an asset owner, I mean, like you're certainly trying, but trying to pay the premium of like what devices, which controller do I get the MFA plugin for versus do I not pay for the MFA for? That's a hard choice, and we've seen time and time again when people sell like secure products, it's pretty difficult to buy them,
Right.
especially with everybody relying on segmentation and using that as their primary, like, well, we're segmented, we're fine. So we're trying to make that decision easier by encouraging this to be just like included in the baseline product. But
Mm-hmm.
I completely digressed from your actual question, which is how did we decide on these 12? So sorry, Michael.
No, that's
Um,
okay.
the the 12 really came out of that threat picture of like Volt Typhoon, and these are the combinations of threats that we know are coming, or actively being exploited in the wild. So that's things like configuration management. How do I know that somebody compromised my system? And can I actually take backups that I can then deploy across the OT network? The concern there being, if somebody gets down in the OT network and is capable of sending bad firmware updates or something like that,
Yeah.
would you even have the ability to fix it yourself? Do you even have the ability to take backups? Some products do, some products don't. Let's see if we can make it more ubiquitous. Similar ideas with like logging. Like logging is not a new concept in PLCs, but security logging sometimes is. Like you're logging for events to see if something bad is happening in your engineering process, but maybe you're not storing user access logs. Let's see if we can get more people storing user access logs, because we know people are dumping passwords and then reusing those passwords. And then people tend to reuse
Exactly.
those passwords in OT. So let's
Hmm.
see if we can get more login attempts going, because that's going to be really useful information if we think an actor is burrowing deep into OT networks.
Right.
Um,
You've mentioned.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Go ahead. No, I was just going to say you've mentioned Volt Typhoon a couple of times, and that really kind of puts a real face on the threat and the risk that to OT. I'm just wondering, I don't know if it's a bad question or to phrase it this way, but just like how do you leverage something like that with vendors, with users to improve their best practices to include functionality? You know, do you guys look at something like Volt Typhoon and say, look, there it is. There's what it would look like. There's possible outcomes. Do you use that?
We try to. It's always a
Yeah,
careful balance, right? I mean, we don't want to be the sort of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt people.
sure.
But we have seen like a real escalation of the threat in terms of compromising. Like the fact that there have been, there's a great congressional testimony that our director Jen Easterly, as well as then director of the NSA General Nakasone, and then director of the FBI Chris Wray gave on threats from PRC, specifically talking about like Volt Typhoon and people trying to create societal panic in the OT network. And I'd encourage people to actually listen to the full congressional testimony, because it is both shocking in the what is literally said. It's shocking in that this is something that people are considering and that we've seen evidence of, that there are actors trying to create or planning societal panic by burying lower into OT networks and planning a compromise in the event of some future conflict.
Right.
And then there's the secondary layer of that, which is this is what we said very publicly in an unclassified setting, which is unusual for the government. And that should perhaps freak people out a little bit more. And so, we try to use it as a motivator, but the main motivation, and I think differential, is that we've run across a lot of utilities who kind of see it as our job is to defend against criminal actors, and nation states are this other thing that we can't be expected to defend against. And I think that paradigm needs to really change, and that's why we're focusing more on these like defense in depth and resilience conversations,
Yeah.
because the expectation can't be I have a perfect cyber wall and my wall keeps out all adversaries, because that's just not how anything works these days. But the expectation of resilience, the expectation of, okay, how quickly can I recover, or can I make it so my bad day is a little bit less bad? Concepts like the Department of Energy's cyber informed engineering work are very much focused on that, like reducing the impact of a cyber attack. Where I would say that concepts like secure by design are very much focused on, okay, how do we make it that every product is as strong of a link in the chain as possible, so that we can reduce the likelihood of compromise as you go further and further into the OT network for this paper, or just generally for any system that somebody might want to compromise.
Right. How are you measuring success here? What are some of the benchmarks you're looking for? I mean, is it a number of vendors or just something a little broader? What's your what's your benchmark for success?
Um, I assure you, Michael, the plan is not to publish a paper and declare victory.
No. Right.
um, throughout this entire process, we were engaged pretty heavily with major control systems vendors to talk through, what is a deal breaker for you? Does this make sense? Are we talking out of our butts? And in reality, you've been capable of doing this the whole time. We've
Hmm.
been having these conversations in part because, springing a document on a group of people that they're just going to get a bunch of questions from their customers with no notice seems a bit rude. But the real benchmark we're trying to hit is, can we see increased uptake of any of these capabilities? And where I think that'll come from is, in the short term, more like secure deployment guidance, just general conversation with the vendors, and like, are you getting more SL2, SL3 products certified? but also customer feedback, right? Like a lot of the motivation for this paper, as we've been discussing, has been our conversations with the asset owners about like what security capabilities and what security functionalities they're actually able to achieve. And so while I don't expect, we're not solving cybersecurity in a year here. This is by definition a long-term initiative. The benchmarks we're really looking for are like the certification levels in the secure deployment guidance, in the product functionalities and specs that we get out. Do we see these things being listed as transparent, as capabilities that are listed in the baseline product? So we're really just going to be trying to keeping track of, really like what are folks selling, and then with the asset owner community, what are folks buying, and
Hmm.
then trying to close that divide as much as possible between where we think things need to be and like not all of these are solved research problems, right? Like not all of these are solved security functionalities. And so I talked about a little bit about my role doing like research and development kind of work at the beginning. We're really trying to close a lot of the gaps in how this can be done successfully. I think one of my favorite issues is secure communications, in part because I come from vehicle networks, and like most OT networks, it is completely unencrypted, it is completely unauthenticated, um, and functionalities have existed to do that, to authenticate traffic, to encrypt traffic for a decade at minimum. I'm thinking of things like DMP3 secure. I'm thinking of things like Modbus over TLS. Like we've had functionalities to add secure communications to OT networks for quite a long time, but we know that the uptake is incredibly low. And we're actually like in the process of conducting voice of customer interviews to get a better understanding from actual utility owners. Why can't you implement these? Why are you having trouble implementing secure communications into your networks? And then we're not just writing guidance telling asset owners, tisk tisk, learn how to do PKI. We're going back to the vendors, to integrators, to the actual protocol specification writers, and trying to then provide that feedback of like, this is where people are struggling to implement the things that you have implemented.
Right.
Let's work through and see how we can make this easier for them. Because the status quo can't be like every operator has to understand how to manage PKI. Like that's a really high bar.
Yeah. And so as you talk to these folks, are there like commonalities in terms of, what they're getting right or what they're getting done, and yeah, like what's the gap between them and the what the vendors are offering or what the vendors support today?
Part of it is that expectation setting.
Uh-huh.
Like a big piece of it is we go to utilities, particularly less sophisticated ones, and the answer will be, I can do segmentation, and I have gotten some sort of continuous monitoring solution working, and I'm kind of good. Like it is difficult for me to justify any additional cybersecurity expense. And or in other cases, default passwords is a good example here. We have a bunch of legacy technology that already has these passwords in place, and my security team uh, is going to have a very difficult and very expensive time trying to actually go and change all of those passwords. And so we're still in that camp of we've got this legacy technology and we've got these operational challenges to make a real difference with the critical infrastructure that we have, right? So you can almost look at secure by design as a let's make sure that if we were to do a greenfield initiative, if we were to build something new, that we actually could do something as secure as we want it to be.
Hmm.
And I think the real challenge for CISA is going to be helping people actually navigate and bridge that gap between the legacy technology they have today and that future greenfield state, because it's always going to be messy. There's always going to be a bunch of old stuff and old dependencies, and then there's always going to be those one-off operational challenges. Like a very real example is trying to do multi-factor authentication in a remote energy environment with no reliable time source is quite difficult technically.
Yeah.
And that's a real challenge, right? And we're not saying that those aren't real. What we're hoping to inspire with this work is to do really reveal some of those research and development challenges so we can highlight the progress that's been made so far and then contribute ourselves, as well as to do more, I'm a big fan of human-centered design style of research. So when I was citing like voice of customer style work before, it's really just getting a better on the ground grasp of, we know that these are problems. And I think sometimes the OT security community or the cybersecurity community at large, and I've been guilty of this many times in my career, can see the first road bump of, this doesn't work cleanly in this environment. And so I'm going to stop because security is far too frictional and this isn't
Right.
going to work. And I think we need to get to a point for OT security to move past these legacy settings. We need to do more voice of customer research, more human centered design research to really work through those problems rather than trying to avoid them.
Hmm.
Because otherwise, my concern is, we call in the core secure by design paper, we call out backwards compatibility as a real issue. Like you can
Yep.
see this in like the Windows operating system, right? Like the number of vulnerabilities that have come out over the years because they have felt obligated to be backwards compatible to something in the 90s. Well, that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of the legacy OT protocols. It's what we're seeing with some of like the operating systems and like lower level chip architectures. And you're never going to move away from backwards compatibility unless you have real solutions that overcome the friction of taking the leap of faith and jumping to something new.
Right.
And so we're really trying to help and do more of that research to help people navigate that incredibly difficult transition.
Hmm. Um, Kind of a related question. I mean, do you hear or anticipate any pushback from automation companies with regard, that cybersecurity maybe is not enough of a differentiator for them? There's only been a handful of real ICSOT attacks or malware samples. Like, do you encounter any of that, or and how do you answer them if you do?
I think the main way that was phrased to us when we were starting on this um, was that asset owners do not care about cybersecurity and they do not pay for cybersecurity. I heard that
Yeah.
so many times in the, especially in the first couple of months of working on this. Um, One of the core themes really from our S4 workshop that we did is we had a number of asset owners, we had a number of integrators, and we had a number of vendors. We had almost an equal split between the vendors and the asset owners. And it became very clear that like all of the vendors were saying, we would love to do this, but the asset owners aren't asking for it. And the asset owners go, I would love to do this, but I can't get this functionality. So
Hmm.
there's a weird communications gap. And part of this is just that it's a shared responsibility model inherently. I mean, critical infrastructure, it comes down to the operator at the end of the day. But if the integrator didn't set it up in a secure way, it's kind of on them. If the vendor doesn't have the security capabilities or didn't follow like a secure software development lifecycle, it's also sort of on them. Um, and it's really easy to kind of play the blame game about who's
Right.
responsible for what, because it gets really thorny really quickly and there's a lot of interdependencies. And so that has been kind of the messaging for vendors on this document has been, okay, nobody is asking for cybersecurity, I will help you get people to ask for cybersecurity. So we are trying to stress that this is important, and I hope the vendors can capitalize on that and try to justify doing it. But fundamentally, yeah, we've absolutely seen that core issue of, well, nobody's going to pay for cybersecurity because either they don't think it's an issue or they think that they have enough mitigating controls as is.
Hmm. And in terms of, I mean, these aren't necessarily requirements; they're recommendations.
Yeah.
It's really hard to enforce this. Just again, is that a conversation about kind of market pressures, et cetera?
Yeah, it is really trying to build out more market incentives.
Yeah.
CISA doesn't really have any regulatory powers in this space, nor are we really gunning for them, right?
Hmm.
Like, secure by
Yep.
design is fundamentally a working with industry to try and align market incentives based off of the risk that we keep seeing, right? Like if threat actors continue to operate as they are, if we continue to see the number of vulnerabilities rise year over year over year, like that's a real problem. The motivation for secure by design when it first started, it came out of this the national cybersecurity strategy that specified we need to move the burden of cybersecurity from those least capable to those most capable. And CISA was tasked with doing that. And that's where
Yeah.
secure by design started. But the history behind it and why we were able to get 17 countries signed on to that initial initiative is because fundamentally cybersecurity, and I hope this rings true with people, cybersecurity is a mission enabling function. It's a support function. It is to allow people to do what they need to do safely and reliably. That is the whole purpose of cybersecurity. Like, we don't do cybersecurity to pay for cybersecurity. We do it to make sure that we can get the real things done. And so if the number of vulnerabilities is going up every year, if the cost of cybersecurity is going up every year, well, that money's got to come from somewhere. And so when our mission enabling functions start eating more and more into our ability to actually conduct the mission we want to do, be that generating power, be that providing clean water, be that running a train system, well, that's a real problem. And so
Hmm.
I think we have gotten a lot of international buy-in. I mean, you can see it from this document. We have the usual like Five Eyes partners co-sealed onto this, but also like Germany, Netherlands, the European Commission. And that's because they view this as a real problem in their critical infrastructure. And so I think that international buy-in will help. It's fundamentally like every country has different regulatory frameworks and is trying to address this in very different ways. But to have multiple countries say, we agree that this is a problem and here are some potential solutions, is a good way of putting a foot in the ground for industry to say, you will not be spending a dollar incorrectly if you spend it here. Like,
Right.
you're going to align in multiple places where you are trying to sell.
Hmm.
So that is the hope. We are trying to really make it easier and to drive more market incentives. And yes, we don't have like regulatory powers to enforce that, but again, like it's this conversation around, truly we think that a lot of the security people already want to do all of this, or at least most of it. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of different routes that we can go for how we implement things. But the core premise of embedding more security into our technology, I don't think is a controversial one. It's really just how can we make the market incentive work.
Right. And I mean, I don't know if proactive is the right word in this context, but I mean, at least you're trying to, I mean, so much legacy technology is out the door. It's hard to kind of pull that back in, but for stuff going forward, it's and as more OT gets connected to the network, and it's really critical that this stuff gets addressed as sooner rather than later. So that's a plus there, obviously.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, the business drivers are only pushing for more interconnectivity, be
Yeah.
that cloud connections, be that like 24/7 vendor support, be that like a wind turbine turnkey solution where it's basically run by the vendor, right? Like,
Hmm.
none of those are necessarily bad things, but they do increase the risk, especially if you're building on top of a legacy network.
Right.
And so we just have to make sure that the technologies exist so that those solutions at least can be more secure.
Hmm. Gotcha. All right, Matt. I think that's a good place to leave it. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to thank you for giving up your time to educate the listeners a little bit. I think this is important stuff, and we'll definitely link to the guide, and hopefully we'll see some adoption, and maybe we can talk about this in a year or so and see where we are.
Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot, Michael.
All righty, thanks, Matt.